So I'm going to talk about my excavations at the site of Bunjuklu over the past 15 years or so. But also I'm going to talk about some work that we did in the immediately preceding period at a nearby site called Punabasha. And these are some of the earliest settled villages and represent, as you'll see, as I think hope to persuade you, we've got evidence for of the appearance of early farming in central Anatolia. More of those topics in a minute. But I know this series is entitled Ancient Wonders of Turkey, and obviously there are many marvelous archaeological sites in Turkey. Some of the most famous, of course, have very large ancient wonders, like, you know, the Neolithic site of Göbekli with its beautiful, large, carved anthropomorphic pillars with all sorts of exciting animal symbolism on them. But also there are Bronze Age cities with huge fortifications like Hattushas, the capital of the Hittites, and classical sites with amazing standing architecture from big temple buildings like Ephesus. I'm hoping to persuade you in my talk today that ancient wonders can come in all sizes, and many other Turkish sites contain ancient wonders, many of which are quite small and appear quite humble visually, but can be very telling about past lifeways. And this even includes microscopic and molecular evidence. And certainly I think more of my ancient wonders I'll present to you are microscopic and molecular, but nevertheless, I think incredibly informative. Before I actually start introducing you to the sites in a bit more detail and the questions we're tackling and the evidence that we're retrieving, it's obviously important for me just to point out that whilst I'm the director, I've been the director of both of these projects based at the University of Liverpool. I work with a Turkish co-director based at one of the Ankara universities, and also with a co-director from the University of Queensland, respectively. That's Dr. Gürkan Mustafalu and Professor Andrew Fairbairn. We're sponsored by many different bodies, and of course we can't work without the help and support and permission from the Turkish Ministry of Culture. So I really should say thank you for the support of all those people. And we also work with the Institute for Field Research, running a field school in conjunction with them. So as a result of all this help, support, and teamwork, really, there's a huge team working at Bunjuklu, including lots of other academics working on some of the different aspects of the evidence, that I can tell you the story I'm going to tell you today, integrating that different evidence. As Matt has neatly introduced already, we're very interested in this transition from hunting and gathering to settled farming communities. And if you think about it, in many ways, this was a dramatic and not necessarily easy to explain transition, in that our species obviously survived and thrived very successfully for 290,000 years or so through hunting and gathering. And it was only around 14 to 12,000 years ago that people started to make this transition to settled life, sometimes also called sedentary life, and partly through that process also started cultivating crops and herding animals. The earliest evidence we have for this transition anywhere in the world, possibly also contemporaneously in China, but therefore one of the two earliest places, is in this fertile crescent that I'm marking out on the slide here of Southwest Asia, which includes southeastern Turkey. And there's been, well over 80 years or so research on this phenomenon in this fertile crescent area. However, the Neolithic, as it's also called, this transition phase to settled agricultural communities, also seems documented on the central Anatolian plateau, which is a slightly different environment from the fertile crescent, about 1,000 meters above sea level. And until we started our work at Bunjuklu and Punabasha, there were a lot of questions about when this transition took place, how and why it took place on the Anatolian plateau, and whether it involved local beginnings of plant and animal management and beginnings of sedentism, or whether it was a result of the spread of farming westwards from the Fertile Crescent. Certainly, it seems that Anatolia generally and central Anatolia also has an important part to play in the spread of farming further west into Europe, somewhat slightly later than the periods I'm going to talk about at Bunjuklu and Punabasha. Farming spread through Turkey into Europe. We know that as part of our recent ancient DNA research from some of the buried individuals at Bunjuklu, we now can clearly say that the genomes of the people of Central Anatolia spread into Southeastern Europe along with farming. So that's already one result. But did people in Central Anatolia initiate farming themselves? And was it a homogeneous process? And that's what I hope to talk to you a little bit about today, along with some other issues, because one of the really exciting and notable features about these early settled farming communities is the way in which they show lots of evidence for elaborate ritual and symbolic practice. The famous pillars in these public buildings, specialized ritual buildings at the site of Göbekli, that's on the top right of my slide, just one example of that. Göbekli partly overlapping in date with the sites that I'm talking about. And then slightly later in the Konya Plain, where I work, the famous World Heritage Site of Çatalhöyük has its elaborate wall paintings and clay reliefs on the wall. So we're very interested, not just in documenting the why, how, and who, if you like, of the transition to settled farming, but also the interrelationship between ritual and elaborate symbolic expression and these developments. And where better to look at that than at sites that seem to predate and be the antecedents of this famous World Heritage Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük. As I said, though, we can talk about larger scale mechanisms involved in the spread of farming, for example, but I think it's also interesting for us to unpack what this means at different scales, looking, across broad regions at the appearance of sedentary settled farming villages as a broad phenomenon is one thing, but what did it really mean for the households and even the individuals who were caught up in this process? How much did their behaviors change and respond? What sort of social arrangements did they have? And how revolutionary was this process for them? So we need to look at the broad regional scale, but we also need to look at the histories of individuals and houses, as I'm going to show you. And I think the nice thing is on the Bunjuklu project, for example, we're doing both. We're looking at a series of different interrelated phenomena at a number of temporal and spatial scales. In particular, I think one of the areas that needs more research is a bit less this question of the transition to farming, which has been worked on a lot, but there's still a lot to learn. But particularly this transition from mobile lifestyles to settled lifestyles. And when we talk about settled lifestyles, I think people have traditionally talked about a switch from, people moving their settlement locales every few days, weeks, or months, as opposed to communities that live year-round in a particular settlement. So settled village life, sedentary life has been defined as living year-round in a permanent settlement. But that really sets up perhaps a bit of a false and hard dichotomy between two ways of life. And it seems perhaps, not necessarily obvious that people would have made just that flip transition from mobility to sedentary behaviors. And should we assume that all of these early settled communities are the same? Indeed, is settled farming village life necessarily a homogeneous phenomenon once it appears in the Neolithic? And we wanted to unpick this a bit more at Bunjuklu. And I think particularly in terms of this question of settled life, it is worth thinking a little bit about not just two states of mobile as opposed to settled, but maybe spectra of behaviors in terms of intensity and continuity of habitation practices over different temporal and seasonal scales. So, as this diagram is starting to show you, we can start to break this down and think about settlement occupation over days, weeks, centuries, millennia, but also variability in degrees of seasonality and multi-seasonality of occupation of settlement. And we might have rather different sorts of early settled communities that perhaps, some of which might occupy a settlement locale for hundreds or even thousands of years, but perhaps only 8 months of the year, and others that might occupy, year-round a settlement, but only for 10 years. And we'd see these as falling in different places in the grid and perhaps of being rather different sorts of early settled communities. So I think we should unpack this question of sedentism a bit more and think also about it at individual as well as group levels, and think about mobility and residential stability in those regards. And that's what I'm going to try and do through some of this, I think, quite exciting evidence, even though that might sound a slightly abstract set of concepts. So let's move now to the concrete evidence and place the sites in space and time. As I said, we're looking at the western part of Turkey, the Anatolian Peninsula, if you like, up on the Anatolian Plateau at 1,000 meters above sea level, in the south central part of the plateau, actually about 4 hours drive from the capital of Ankara. As I said, this is the Konya Plain. It's a low-lying, within the Taurus mountain region, a low-lying, internally drained basin. The rivers run from the Taurus mountains around the edges of the plain into the central plain. But when I say low-lying, it's only in relation to the adjacent mountains. We are at 1,000 meters above sea level, so it is quite cold in winter, for example, and cooler than the coast in the summer. The survey I did in this area actually picked up a number of broadly contemporary sites dating to the period immediately following the last ice age. So one of the interesting things that even before we started digging that we appreciated was that actually these communities exist in little clusters, and that's something I want to return to at the end. So we've excavated two of a group of perhaps 4, 5 or 6 of these communities within this inland drainage basin, and they're all in the vicinity of the somewhat later site of Çatalhöyük, the World Heritage Site. Bunjuklu is about 9.5 kilometers to the north, and Pınarbaşı is to the southeast, and Bunjuklu and Pınarbaşı are about 30 kilometers apart. And really what I'm going to give you in a way is a tale of two villages, but talking a bit about the Bunjuklu evidence in more detail. That's the spatial context. What's the chronological context? And this immediately allows us to start thinking about questions of longevity and continuity at these sites. The site, this is a little diagram showing the carbon-14 dates that allow us to date these sites. If you want to ask more about some of these methods later, I'm happy to explain a little bit more, but I won't say too much because obviously I want to get on with the conclusions rather than all the detailed evidence. But basically this graph shows the modeling of particular sets of dates to show that Pınarbaşı is basically occupied from, actually it's occupied from about 9,500 BC right the way down to about 7,800 BC. The transition from the last ice age to the modern interglacial period, warmer period in which we live, was just before 9,500 BC. So very quickly after post-glacial warming, we see people starting to settle in the Konya Plain. And with one of these long-lived settlements, Pınarbaşı, is lasting between 1,200 and 1,600 years. So that's already a good indication of settled life of a sort. The site of Bunjuklu starts a little bit later. These are the dates for Bunjuklu up at top, and they run from about 8,300 to a little later than Pınarbaşı, about 7,600. And that's interesting because it shows whilst Pınarbaşı starts before Bunjuklu, is occupied before Bunjuklu, Bunjuklu joins it as a second settlement on the Konya Plain, and for several hundred years is partially contemporary. So we have two contemporary communities on the Konya Plain to allow us to understand this transition, which I think is very useful. And Bunjuklu as well, of course, is occupied over many centuries. It's showing that longevity that we might understand to be part of settled behavior. But that's at a very broad scale. We can start to think about, as I said, some of these more nuanced aspects of what these settled behaviors actually involve by looking at the seasons that people are occupying these sites. And we can look at the seasons through the evidence of the exploitation of plant and animal resources. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I want to just give you the broad picture. Bunjuklu is the lower part of the diagram here. Pınarbaşı is the upper, and you can see the different seasons and months marked here. The important thing is the black bars mark when we've got lots of evidence of the exploitation of certain resources at particular seasons. And the key thing you can see here is at Bunjuklu, we've got black bars relating to year-round occupation of the site, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. So this really does look like an early sedentary settlement in the classic sense of not just many centuries of occupation, but year-round occupation over those centuries. We'll certainly look at questions of continuity and intensity of occupation in a moment, but that multi-seasonality aspect is well indicated. At Punabasha, there's a not dramatically different picture, and indeed many of the same seasons, especially winter and spring and late summer, are very well represented at Punabasha as well. And this is important because, one option is that perhaps, these sites are used by the same community, but given that they're occupied over the same time periods, at least in the latter part of the occupation of Punabasha, and the same seasons, that seems unlikely. They seem to be two contemporary separate communities. But interestingly, there are points in the seasonality of exploitation of resources where there doesn't seem to be so much clear activity at Punabasha. So maybe people at Punabasha went away a little bit more, or some people at Punabasha went away a little bit more for certain parts of the year, particularly the early summer, probably. So whilst it's probably occupied for maybe 8, 9, 10 months of the year, at least some people are going away for part of the time. So I think we are looking at slightly different sorts of settled behavior already from this evidence. We do have other evidence talking of molecular and microscopic evidence as being part of the wonders that allow us insights into people's behavior in the past. We've got other insights into things like mobility from the evidence of isotopes, chemical isotopes from the bones of the people buried at Bunjuklu and Punabasha. And this little chart, again, we don't have to worry too much about the details, but it's showing that all of the people at Punabasha and Bunjuklu spent, at least these are indications of isotopes that were deposited in the teeth of these individuals in childhood. So this is showing where they spent the childhood. And this box here are isotope signatures for the Konya Plain. So they certainly spent their childhoods in the Konya Plain, both people from both communities. And the Bunjuklu group cluster nicely together, strongly suggesting that this is the local signature for Bunjuklu. People spent their childhoods in the immediate vicinity of Bunjuklu, certainly from the isotope signatures, or at least most people seem to have. We'll talk a bit more about other individuals in a moment or two. So that's good further evidence of continuity of occupation. Punabasha has these crosses of Punabasha, that has a slightly different signal, which is good. You'd expect that, again, two different communities. But interestingly, the isotopes do tell us that that in their childhood, some of these Punabasha individuals certainly spent some of their time a bit to the north of the site of Punabasha itself, and even north of the Boncuklu site. So that again reinforces the fact that probably for part of the year, actually groups of the community moved away, because of course these are children that are spending their time away from the site. So presumably they were accompanying adults in trips away from the settlement. So we do have a slightly different degree of residential commitment to occupation of these locations. The other exciting thing to notice is just one Bunjuklu male actually seems to have spent some of his childhood in the same locations as the Punabasha individuals. So perhaps this is someone who moved from Punabasha to Bunjuklu when they were an adult, and shows maybe some individual mobility between these communities. There's one other Bunjuklu individual who spent quite a lot of time quite a bit further south in the plain in her childhood and appears to have joined the Bunjuklu community as an adult, probably, or she spent a lot of time away as a child. So we're starting to unpick through these molecular techniques, if you like, exciting information about residential practices in these communities at individual as well as group level. So much for settled behavior and what it might mean. And I think I've already started to show you perhaps it isn't a completely homogeneous, unvarying phenomenon. What about this question of the transition of farming? Well, I've got a quick answer to that because I want to move on to quite a few other things. You can see this is a list of the carbonized plant remains that we find at these sites. And this is a list of the earliest domesticated species that we have from the Near East more generally. And you can see that at Punabasha, there isn't any evidence of domesticated plants or even the wild versions of these plants. The people at Punabasha were not interested in exploiting these plants. So in terms of plant exploitation, they remain through this whole period a forager community. However, at Bunjuklu, we have clear evidence for these early domestic plants. So around 8,300 BC on the Konya Plain, we see the introduction of cultivated plants. Interestingly, it's taken up by the Bunjuklu community, but completely rejected by the Punabasha community. So two contemporary settled communities, one of which is of farmers, another not. Interestingly, though, even though the Bunjuklu community is taking plant cultivation up, we can compare the frequency and ubiquity of the carbonized seeds of these first cultivated plants at Bunjuklu with just slightly later farming sites like Çatalhöyük and Janasan, and we can see immediately that these elements are less common at Bunjuklu. Even though Bunjuklu is adopting farming, it looks like it's actually small scale cultivation. So we have an answer to who the first farmers were on the Konya Plain, but interestingly, it doesn't look like they adopt plant cultivation wholesale. Some communities reject it indeed, but even at Bunjuklu, they're just adopting it on a small scale. And microscopic plant cells, phytoliths they're called, show us that the farming must have been done close to the Bunjuklu site, in actually what was quite a wet environment, which may explain why they didn't adopt very large scale farming immediately. It doesn't mean that people at Punabasha, and these are pictures from the site of Punabasha, didn't exploit plants significantly. It looks like, in fact, they exploited a lot of wild plant resources, including wild nuts and fruits, like these are carbonized almond and pistachia terebinth shells. And here are some of the fruits locally growing still in the wild on the local mountain. So at Punabasha, they exploited different plants more intensively, especially the woodlands of the edge of the plain. What about animal exploitation? Obviously, transition to farming ultimately involves animal management. It would appear that at both sites, there isn't any sort of major role for herded animals at either Bunjuklu or Punabasha. At both sites, these histograms show you the percentages of the different animal species at various of these central Anatolian sites. Punabasha is here, Bunjuklu here, and at both sites you can see the blue bars are high. These are wild cattle, aurochs now extinct, sadly. The last one went extinct in the 18th century. These are animals that stood, 1.5 times as high as an adult human male. So they're huge animals. They were not just frequent at these sites, but they yielded a lot of meat. So these were important for people's diets. So that's shared as part of the hunting practices between these communities. But otherwise, there are differences. Interestingly, at Bunjuklu, there's a lot more sus pig, and the bones again suggest these are wild boar that are heavily hunted at Bunjuklu. And that's interesting because there are wetlands close to Punabasha too, and boar would have been a wetland-loving animal. But it seems that Punabasha hunters had different interests in, whilst they say it shared some interest, had interest in different prey. And they indeed hunted a bit more sheep and goat, which became ultimately the important domestic animal at the slightly later site of Çatalhöyük. So there are really interesting differences in hunting practices at these sites. And most intriguing of all is the fact that sheep and goats that became the first herded animals in the area are very uncommon at Bunjuklu. They were hardly eaten at all at Bunjuklu, it would appear. Nevertheless, we do have interesting evidence that they were herded. We have herbivore dung, sheep and goat dung, almost certainly in the fires. This is evidence from microscopic thin sections of our hearths. We got the evidence of that this is animal dung being burnt in the hearth. And we also have, again, from isotopes, these are carbon and nitrogen isotopes, from the actual sheep, a very odd dietary signatures from the sheep that suggest they've been brought down from the hills and are kept near the site. So people are keeping small numbers of animals close to Bunjuklu, but we don't see that evidence again at Punabasha. So at Bunjuklu, we're seeing small-scale animal management that matches the small-scale animal cultivation. And very interestingly, presumably, given how infrequent these sheep and goat are at Bunjuklu, they're not doing that as a big contribution of meat to the diet. They're probably doing that for things, secondary products like animal dung, and possibly milk, for example. So that's very interesting. People haven't suggested that as a mechanism for the transition to farming before, I think. But again, I think I've illustrated the non-homogeneous nature of the behavior of these communities as part of this transition to the farming. And this is further emphasized, I think, by the frequency of wetland resources at Bunjuklu. Certainly, but surrounded by extensive wetland, and we've got lots of evidence of the hunting of aquatic birds, lots of fishing, and indeed from evidence of human coprolites. You can see microscopic studies of poo are very interesting for us. We've actually even got lots of evidence of water vole and frog being eaten by humans. There's huge amounts of frog bones at the site, and these were obviously part of this quite diverse forager diet amongst this early farming community at Bunjuklu. And we see less of this evidence of aquatic resources at Punabasha. So we have this picture I've summarized in the table here of actually very diverse processes in the adoption of settled life and transitions to agriculture on the Anatolian plateau. Were these very earliest farmers of central Anatolia at Bunjuklu, did they domesticate local species? I think part of the evidence is already clear from Punabasha, where we don't see any of these species in any of these plant species in the record at all. So it seems these species were imported to the Konya Plain as part of the introduction of farming. They spread from areas south and east in the Fertile Crescent into the Konya Plain. Was it farmers that brought them, or is it local foragers that adopt them? Well, I think we've got clear evidence to answer that question too. The chipstone, the material culture of the Bunjuklu community is identical to that of Punabasha, which predates the appearance of farming, of course, at Bunjuklu. So it seems these are local foragers, local knowledgeable wetland foragers, if you like, who adopt farming from areas to the south and east, although perhaps starting to take into management local sheep and goat. And this is further borne out by evidence from ancient DNA. We've got ancient DNA from early human burials at the site of Punabasha and our humans from Bunjuklu, where we see 90% genetic continuity between humans from about 15,000 BC at Punabasha and those from about 8,300, 8,000 BC at Bunjuklu. So there's direct genetic continuity in these foragers on the Anatolian plateau, which we've demonstrated from our work. You might ask then, how did these domestic crops arrive in the Konya Plain? Well, they probably arrived through trade and exchange. Exchange, probably a better term. We've actually got lots of evidence of stuff circulating in central Anatolia and between central Anatolia and coastal areas and the Fertile Crescent to the south. At Punabasha and Bunjuklu, through the time periods I'm talking about, we have lots of these marine shell beads that are coming up from the Mediterranean coast 220, 240 kilometers away. Obsidian, black volcanic glass, which makes up the toolkits, the bulk of the toolkits of these communities is circulating between central Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent. So it's through these interactions and mechanisms. And we have other evidence of adoption of common practices, of features of burial practice like skull removal, for example, to clearly show that exchange was involved. You might wonder whether some of the people from the Konya Plain went to the coast, for example, to get these materials, or to Anatolia. But I just remind you of how Konya Plain oriented the strontium and oxygen isotope evidence is. These people are not going that far afield, at least, as groups. Maybe the odd individual has. So that I've introduced you to the transition to settled behaviors and farming. I want to spend the second half of the lecture talking a little bit more about what this meant for people and households caught up in these processes. And we've got a very rich record, I think, of habitation practices and also symbolic and ritual practices from the buildings, particularly at Bunjuklu. But again, microscopic evidence has allowed us to interpret these and understand these in really informative ways, I think. First of all, one of the notable things about the Bunjuklu community is the way that we see the appearance of curvilinear mud brick built buildings, houses at the site that have a lot of standard features. People are building very similar houses to each other at the site of Bunjuklu. They're built out of mud brick, they're cut a bit into the ground. What you can see here is actually the substructure of these houses, and that's what survives for us to recognize. Interestingly, the same principle of construction is adopted at Punabasha, or existed already at Punabasha actually, but at Punabasha they didn't use mud brick, and here at Bunjuklu they're using mud brick. So this is another evidence of some difference. At both sites, the walls and floors of the houses are plastered, as you can see here. And it seems that actually many layers of plaster are laid down. These are micromorphological thin sections through the floors of the houses. These little red marks on the plan of the building show where we took these blocks from to study the floor deposits in microscopic detail. Here's a microscopic thin section slide, and you can see the very clean clays used in the plaster floors and the microorganic debris of occupation in between them. And we see actually many plasterings of these buildings. Interestingly, the Bunjuklu ones are plastered more frequently, many more times anyway, we can say. At Punabasha, typically there are between about 3 and 7 floors in houses. At Bunjuklu, there are between about 6 and 25, 28 actually across our different houses. And we see these as annual floor plasterings. Our C14 dating allows us to say that, I think, with some confidence. So these actually provide us with what you might call as floor clocks for the history of these houses. And we can document the changing features in the houses, the shifting of features in the houses, and the use of these houses over time. We can build up little histories of these houses through, as a result of these repetitive and I would say structured practices of refurbishment of the house. Very interestingly, at Bunjuklu, but not at Punabasha, there's a very structured pattern to the use and refurbishment of these houses over these several years of occupation. In particular, at Bunjuklu, the houses are divided into a kitchen area in the northwest with a big hearth in, and a clean southeastern area, which was presumably the socializing and sleeping area for the household. But interestingly, this area, which is kept very clean, you can see how clean these plaster floors are compared to the dirtier floors around the kitchen in the hearth. There's a very strong division in the use of space here through repetitive practice, but also built into the structures, if you like. But this southeastern area is also used for ritual and symbolic practice. So I see this distinction as having a strong symbolic dimension between clean and dirty areas. It's in this clean area that we find floor and wall paintings, installations of animal heads built into the walls, for example, and human burials as well. You can see where the floor is missing here on the right of this picture of one of the Bunjuklu houses, and that's where someone was buried. So people were buried under the floors in which their household members slept on, or at least people affiliated to the house were buried under the house floors. Because obviously this isn't some of the visually the most exciting archaeology, I just wanted to show you some of our reconstructions of these houses. These are our reconstructions of houses that we've made to help visitors understand these buildings a bit better, and that we also use them for experimental archaeology to help interpret the archaeology on site. And we do all sorts of experiments, monitoring temperature and fuel use and the like in the house. And this is associated with our little visitor center here, where we have displays that explain the site. Ultimately, we'd like to roof one of our excavated Neolithic buildings, and we're trying to fundraise for that effect. We'd like to put a shelter over one of the original Neolithic houses so people can continually visit it and compare it with our reconstruction buildings. But we are talking about what buildings that would have looked a little bit like this, very simple one-room buildings, albeit they have this elaborate division and use of space inside the structure. And as I said, that seems to have a symbolic and, I would argue, ritual dimension. And there are other features as well. These houses are continually rebuilt on the same location. This is a little sequence of houses. There's actually 6 of them in total that are built one on top of the other over, if we take the floor clock as a guide, over a 75-year period. So people are continually rebuilding the house in the same location. They didn't have to do that at the site of Bunjuklu. There's lots of open space between the houses. They could have moved their houses around, but they chose to keep rebuilding them in the same location. And I think that's a symbolic statement of continuity, if you like, but also a desire to live over the dead ancestors, who of course are buried under the house floors, under the floors of earlier houses. And I'll show you direct evidence for ancestry in a minute. So it's a symbolic statement of continuity, building over the ancestors, living over the ancestors, but I think also living over the ancestral house was quite important. And as I hope to illustrate to you, I think, you know, the way in which these houses have elaborate ritual and symbolic evidence shows a strong identity between the household and the house, and a symbolic equation of household and the house. So much so that I think we can even perhaps talk about Bunjuklu houses as animate houses, if you like. And what strikes me here is that division between clean and dirty space that I've talked about already. You know, many communities categorize different parts of the human body as clean or dirty, symbolically as well as perhaps literally. So the houses perhaps are, you know, also treated similarly. And like the body, the Bunjuklu house was maintained and sometimes decorated with red paint. I've mentioned the red painted floors and wall plaster reliefs. Here's the base of one, here, for example. And like people, houses had significant moments marked in ritual. You know, our floor clock tells us that these ritual and symbolically charged events were sporadic. They occurred perhaps once every 5, 10, 15 years during the history of these houses. So these are rites of passage probably for people and houses simultaneously. And we can see that further in what happens when the house is dismantled and rebuilt, if you like, when the house dies and is reborn, and indeed perhaps at major moments of refurbishment. At such moments, the posts of the house are removed, the roof of the house is removed, or people's bodies are treated in the same way. Human heads are removed as part of mortuary practice and circulate within the community. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But those heads are deposited in post holes, for example. And we see other deposits as well. This is a delightful bear figurine, for example, that's deposited in the bottom of a post hole with an obsidian core, for example. Other special tools and figurines are deposited in the bottom of post holes. So I think the disarticulation of the house matches the disarticulation of the human body. And just like some people have burial goods placed within them, houses have, you know, deposits placed within them, associated with their stages of transition, if you like. Related to this is the deployment of animal heads, in head parts in particular, within the houses, and these are built into the houses. So we have some of these bucrania. This on the plan here, you see building 4, and this was a double bucrania, 2 wild aurochs heads, 2 of the biggest wild aurochs heads that we have evidence from the site, are built into the walls. Actually, these were built in as a foundation event, as part of the birth of the house, and perhaps they were built in to protect the house. They were present throughout the life of the house, maybe guarding the inhabitants. Interestingly, when they were placed in, you can see, you know, what's dramatic about these bucrania are these massive horns that would have stuck out into the building. But in inserting this double bucrania, the occupants chose to lop off either side, adjacent side of the cattle skull, so they could be placed together and create the impression either of a double-headed animal or a massive-headed animal. So probably mythical associations, perhaps, with these practices. But they show the importance of ritual and symbolism. We see things like boar jaws here inserted into niches in the walls, with the niches staying open, so people could see the boar jaw, and especially the tusks sticking out. Interestingly, whilst many houses have this sort of symbolic paraphernalia, they're not identical in any way across the house. Each household expresses its own identity through this ritual practice, which is an intriguing indication of, I think, the growing importance of household identities in these early settled communities. And I want to come back just for a second to the fact that typically only parts of these skulls or bits of these animals are inserted. And we often find, here in the lopping off of the massive horns of these two bucrania on one side, you would create two hornclaws, and we sometimes find individual horns in walls. So I think there's a process of obviously incorporating these things into walls, but sharing them between households. So while households are developing strong individual identities, they're also making connections between each other through these ritual practices of sharing symbolic material. Of course, the other evidence of ritual and symbolism we have is the burial of the dead under the house floor, the ancestors, as I've said, and I'll show you genetic evidence in a minute. We really are talking about ancestral burials. And quite a few houses have people buried under house floors. But interestingly, sometimes we don't see quite enough people. And sometimes we do see quite a few people, like the 6 or 7 individuals in building 14. Here's one of them. But there's in the sequence of 6 houses I showed you before, there are perhaps only between 2 and 4 dead people, mostly children, buried over a 75-year period. That doesn't seem enough people. So there are some missing dead. And here we can then turn perhaps to other areas of activity, corporate activity, group activity, if you like. And we know where those missing dead are because they're buried in the central parts of the site between the houses in public space, if you like. Interestingly, while all burials under the houses that we've excavated have their skulls present, some of the people buried in the graves in external areas have their skulls detached. Here's a pile of 3 human skulls at the end of one big pit full of disarticulated bones. So the mortuary practices differ between people buried outside the houses and those buried inside the houses, which suggests interestingly complex social arrangements at Bunjuklu. Some ancestors are buried under the house, the living house, if you like. Some are buried in more public spaces. And interestingly, the people buried in more public spaces often have more grave goods, especially the adults. Here you can see some of these marine shell beads creating a necklace around the underneath the jaw of an adult individual in these open spaces, in these midden areas, if you like. I think we've got good evidence that the skulls removed from some of these burials actually circulate for a period in the open spaces and then end up buried separately. I've already pointed out to you this inverted human cranium buried in its own little pit in these open spaces. An analysis of the human bones from these midden spaces, some of which are just scattered around, show a preponderance of cranial head elements, probably some of which are just placed on the middens as part of collective ritual practices in the open spaces. So the houses might have been a focus for ritual and symbolism, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that open spaces were perhaps for more public activity. And it's interesting that it's in these open space mortuary areas that we get the deposition of big stone artifacts in particular. Most of our flints and obsidian pieces that are tools from Bunjuklu are tiny, as I've showed you pictures of already. But we have, for example, this really massive flint blade from a little cache next to the burials in the open spaces at Bunjuklu, showing more evidence for ritual practice. And this table just sums this up. In external areas, particularly in the main external area, we've excavated these midden spaces in Area M, as it's called. We've got 58% of the burials with grave goods, whereas in buildings, adults, only 18% of adults have grave goods associated with them. So there are clear differences in the treatment of adults in these open spaces. And we can go back to the isotope evidence to explore this a little bit more. We can look at carbon and nitrogen. This is nitrogen, this is carbon isotopes that tell us something about the diet of these peoples. And interestingly, the people buried in the open spaces here, especially the skulls of the disarticulated individuals that are shown as these squares, these people had slightly different diets from the people buried under the houses that are these diamonds in particular. And these are the animal species that these people ate and their isotopes. And we can look at the relationship between animal and human isotopes here to see what people ate. Interestingly, the people buried in the houses, they ate more of this animal, which is the wild cattle, the aurochs, from which the bicrania derive in the houses, while the people whose skulls circulate as part of mortuary collective practices seem to have eaten more fish and water birds. Undoubtedly, the diet overlapped a bit. It wasn't completely different, but it does seem to be separated by different practices. So it seems that even though household identity was important, there was an important role for collective practices that involve people eating together, collective mortuary ritual practice for some people from some of these houses, not all of the people from the houses. And so differences expressed, differences through social practices in life are continued in death, if you like. The final bit of evidence that I just want to look at that allows us to understand a little bit more about these households at Bunjuklu and perhaps the way in which households change as a result of adopting more intense sedentary practices and agriculture, even on a small scale, even if not on a revolutionary basis, comes from our latest ancient DNA work. And that was only just published yesterday, actually. So you're really getting this very hot off the press. And this is where we've actually been able to document direct genetic relationships between people buried under the house floors. And as I said, start to disentangle the history of individual households caught up in these processes. And this clearly shows that people buried under the house floors were related, genetically related, through first-person genetic relationships to each other. So here we have two houses. This is one house down here, building 12. It dates before building 14. It's the earlier house before building 14. This is a sequence of houses, as I've described already. And here you see actually there were actually two burials in building 12, one after about 5 or 6 years, a 10-year-old child buried with this amazing shell necklace of over 100 marine shells from 220 kilometers away, elaborate grave goods for this child. About 11 years later, this adult male was buried in the house. And then about 10 years later, this house was demolished and the new house was built. And this person's sister was buried, adult female, was buried in this new house after about a year of its existence. So you can see how that continuity in their houses must have been, you know, direct, short time span. Related siblings are buried in these houses, one replacing the other. So direct family continuities, people who we know spent their childhood here, Bunjuklu, from the strontium evidence that I suggested. I've shown you, the isotope evidence I've shown you already. So we've got ancestry, we've got continuity as part of this construction, if you like, of settled communities. After about 10 more years, another child was buried, and then a few more years later, an adult male and then an adult female. The adult male and adult female were both related genetically as well. The adult male was a son, and the adult female was his mother. The evidence is pretty clear cut here. So again, direct genetic continuity. However, there is one person that we can say was not genetically related to the people buried in this set of houses, and that is very intriguingly a perinatal baby, a baby that died around the time of birth, buried with the lady we can call the sister in building 14. And that's really interesting because, you know, initially we might have thought, oh, well, perinatal child, adult female, and perhaps she died in childbirth with the baby. But that isn't the case. She isn't that baby's mother. That baby is not related to anyone else buried in these houses. It was a neonate that presumably died around the time of this adult female. And for some reason, it was appropriate to include her, because we know genetics really helps us here. We know this little baby was a female too. So we can start to really tease apart interesting life stories here, I think. But she wasn't related. So these households are perhaps constructed in interesting ways, not purely through these first-person tight little nuclear family relationships, but through other forms of kinship as well. The genetic continuities are interesting as well when we compare them with other features of this little set of buildings. Even though the children actually have grave goods in these houses, and there are a couple of them, as I've said already, the adults don't. And this is a stark contrast with other burials, even in other houses. So there is some distinctive identity signatures, if you like, in these household groups. And we see that too, even in the evidence of activity and disease from the genetic evidence and the pathological evidence from these burials. The son, as I call him, this adult male here, he had one of the earliest examples we've got of hepatitis B, for example. All of these adults shared a lot of wear on their spines from carrying heavy loads. They did things in similar ways in this household, and they were buried in similar ways that marked out this little household from some of the other households in the community. Finally, though, one of the really intriguing things is, even though they're all associated with this little set of household, this continuous living household, if you like, and they were all apparently born in the Bunjuklu area and spent their early childhood here, that individual who I call the son, he seems to have gone away during the last 10 years of his life, at least for significant periods of time. The carbon and nitrogen isotopes that he demonstrates, he's here on the isotope diagram. You can see he's way to the right, let's say, of all of the animals at Bunjuklu and all of the other people. And that's because he's eating rather different foods in his diet in the last 10 years of his life. And that's almost certainly because obviously the local animals don't show these signatures, because he's going somewhere else for significant periods of the year or for a few years at a time. So he goes away and comes back. And this allows us, I think, to unpack some interesting individual stories of mobility within this broader development of settled behavior. So I hope to have shown you here both how we can build a bigger picture of this transition to settled life and agriculture at a broad scale, temporal and geographical, but we can actually start to unpack what it meant in terms of things like ritual behavior, symbolic behavior, but also the histories and identities of particular households. And I just want to come back to the point I made right at the beginning, which is one of the really intriguing things here is the way in which these communities at Punabasha and Bunjuklu express different sorts of identities through this process. And I think the very business of adopting settled life or agriculture is partly dependent on people trying to define themselves individually and as communities in distinct ways in this period of transition. So I'll stop there.